to get to introduce our three terrific panelists. Their full bios are in the booklet, but Patrick Markey, to my right, is Executive Director of National Collections, U.S. Conference of Catholic Bishops. So when he arrives at your parish, be careful. Next to him, Brian Hughes is coordinator of the Leadership Roundtable's investment initiative. And then our third discussant is Mary Quilici Aumack, who is, has an interesting job. She's executive director of the Santa Clara Community Foundation, which is here, and it does a lot of the funding of the San Jose Diocese ministries. Our theme this afternoon, co-responsibility for church finances, has three major topics. One is best practice in investments. Second is best practices in fundraising and stewardship. And the third is best practices for parish business managers and finance councils. I think we're not going to totally follow that direction, but those are the basic topics that we're all going to address. And interleaved in that, in my mind, are a couple of different things. One is the standards of excellence that people talked about this morning, and how that can be a resource for encouraging and highlighting financial best practices. Second comment I would make would be, I think we're going to talk about more accountability, and that certainly echoes one of Chris's themes this morning. And last is transparency, which Lori talked about in her question of Chris this morning. So with that, let me turn it over to Patrick.
Good afternoon. Can you hear me? Is this on? Okay, great. Thank you for having me here. I'm very happy to be here. As it was said, I work at the Bishops' Conference, National Collections Office. The conference isn't really good at titles of offices, so when I go to family reunions, some relatives don't show up because they think I'm a debt collector. But that's actually not what we're doing. So we're raising money in the parishes through the second collections principally. So we raise between $70 and $80 million a year with the collections that the conference manages. And then we run grant-making programs like CCHD, Eastern Europe, Latin America, home missions to give the money away. Just a little background. I'm an accountant, if you saw, by training. So I tend to be a bit conservative financially in the way I look at life, and I tend to not trust people very much because that's the way we're trained as auditors. And I worked the first couple years in investment banking, and so that really helped me not to trust people. Luckily, then I began to work for the church, and so I spent the next part of my career working in publishing, Catholic publishing, and then that brought me to the conference. And then I went a little bit back to my accounting background when they asked us to put together this Office of National Collections, which we've been doing for the past 5 years. So it's about raising funds, it's about giving away funds, and it puts us in an international arena, so we work and see the church from an international perspective, from the Vatican. My office works a lot with the Vatican. We give money to Eastern Europe, Latin America, Africa. So we're engaged with dioceses across these parts of the world, and also here at home through the CCHD collection, through the Home Missions collection. So we're engaged with the dioceses here that are in the most need of help and trying to support them. So I don't know if you know the way the USCCB works, but so the bishops are the members, and they've organized themselves by committee. And so the staff, those of us who work at Washington, we staff committees. And so I staff a committee called the National Collections Committee, 9 bishops, and then 6 subcommittees that are a part of that. So about 44 bishops at any given time. That's who I work for. What my committee has been focusing on, and it really dovetails a lot into everything that we've talked about today, is accountability, transparency, donor intent. In fact, we just published a document, the committee published a document that they brought in front of the full body of bishops for approval, and I think it passed at like a 98% approval rating, which is pretty high for the Bishops' Conference, and it's I brought about 20 copies with me. I didn't know how many to bring, and I brought them at the last minute. So if anyone's interested, I'll have them available. And it's about managing collections in parishes. We start with national collections because that's what we're about. But in general, how do you manage funds on a parish, diocesan, and national level, especially when you're dealing with donors, with those who are giving us the money? So what are the things that we have to keep in mind? What's canon law say? What does civil law say? What do just ethics and morals say? So the committee's focused a lot of attention on these issues. And I bring that up because it's a big area that we haven't managed well institutionally because things have become more complicated. So, I mean, to kind of explain why, what Chris had said before is it's more complicated than it was 15 years ago. It's more complicated than it was 40 years ago. And because of that, we need to be more and more accountable and transparent. We need to keep up with the times. And we're also more educated because we're talking about co-responsibility. So I think we've seen, at least in my lifetime, I was born when Vatican II was underway, lay people have taken their responsibility, and they've taken it seriously, especially here in the United States, to work as partners in the church. And I want to say that this actually, when you talk about Pope Francis, also I'm a big fan of everything that he says. I watch my Pope app most mornings when I can. And I see a strong call from him on these issues. So just this morning, he started a new commission to give him information about the Vatican Bank's operations. He's not making decisions about it. He just wants to know how the whole thing runs. And so do I. So I would love to see what it is that he finds out. And if you look at that commission, certainly there are cardinals on it, but there are also other people. There's an American laywoman on it as well. So I think that that's a message that I'm seeing from the very top that says, yeah, it is true. We have to move into this area, and we have to work towards accountability. And then this brings us to the area of co-responsibility. But before going into that, I want to make a comment about not-for-profits in general. I've been working in the not-for-profit world for a long time, since I left investment banking. And what I've discovered is that we have this focus on budgeting and planning that's really out of proportion often to what we're actually doing. But we put a lot of time and energy into it on board and on a governance level, but also on a staff level in a lot of our organizations, and not just Catholic. But we're really bad when it comes to what actually happened. We tend not to care about financial statements or asking people why does it say that and what happened and where did we get there. And we tend not really to care about what took place. You look at those numbers and you can see the numbers that we had seen earlier, I don't have a PowerPoint, about the drop in attendance among Catholics, and we don't give that the same energy that we give a lot of other things. And I find that very perplexing. And so I work a lot with planning at the Bishops' Conference, and I also work with a lot of other Catholic organizations consulting to help them out with their planning processes. And that's one of the things that's become very apparent to me, that we're at the conference, we focus on our budgets as if they really mattered. But at the end of the day, what really matters is what happened. And so I think we have to conceptually turn it around and say, yeah, budget's important, the plan is important, but how can we be focused on results? How can we hold people accountable and institutions accountable for what's actually happening? So what I see often in not-for-profits and in the church is when you say, hey, let's evaluate what happened, or let's evaluate the people, there's resistance to that. And so that's something I think that we have to be aware of, and we have to address more and more, because it's certainly not a best practice. And what I was working with a group called the Croziers. They're a religious institute, and they're out of Phoenix, and I've been helping them with their strategic planning. And in doing that, at a certain point, I realized, oh, well, I was reading some of the best literature, and there was a lot of talk about results-based budget planning now. And so we did a whole strategic planning model with them that was all results-based. And then we took that and we modeled it with what we're doing at the conference right now, because it's really a good approach, and I think there's a lot to it. So I'm supposed to talk about co-responsibility, the role of the hierarchy and the laity. I guess when you think of co-responsibility, since we're a hierarchical church, that's really what we're talking about. You know, there's the hierarchy that has its role in governance and leadership, but then there's the role that the lay people have as well. And so how do they work together, and how do those things interact? From an international experience, working with the people that are at the Vatican, working with bishops' conferences around the world, I could say that that's really something that is an act in a lot of areas, more than we often know. I mean, sometimes I feel like I get a vision of things that a lot of people aren't aware of. So if I'm at a diocese in Argentina, that's a rural diocese, and you go out into the capillas, to the chapels, they're run by women, right? So this is in leadership roles, and that's just the reality of the local church. And if I go to the Vatican and I go into the IOR, the bank, or if I go to some of the other offices, they're run by lay people, right? If you're at the bishops' conference, for the most part, we're lay people. So there is a role there. And so what I see is that there's different roles and responsibility, and we have to be very respectful of that. So as Roundtable, when you're engaging with the church, I think we have to keep in mind that, yes, it's a round table, but most bishops wouldn't feel, because you're talking about the church, that they fit as one person among many at the table, right? And rightfully so, because ecclesiologically we don't work that way. You know, there is a hierarchy, and that's what we're dealing with. But why is there the hierarchy? Because there's a different role and responsibility. So we have to be observant to that role and respectful of the role that the bishop or the priest or the person that has that call, that vocation to do that work. We have to be respectful of that, but at the same time, we have to recognize that we have a role as well. And we have to take up that role, a vocation, if you will, and respond to it. So I want to just point out two documents that the bishops wrote in the 90s. One is Stewardship, a Disciple's Response. Most of you are probably aware of that document. It's a wonderful document about stewardship. It's a foundational document on what it means to be called to be a steward. And the other document that was published about the same time is Go and Make Disciples, and that's a document on evangelization. Father Healey's here. The bishops meant for those to go hand in hand. You can't take one without the other. And so what does that say? That if we're good stewards, we evangelize. And if we really want to be those who evangelize, we have to be good stewards. So here's Pat Markey speaking. What happened in the abuse crisis? It was a moment where, as church, we weren't being good stewards. Okay? We weren't taking upon our responsibility and responding in a way that was credible, and therefore we weren't evangelizing. And I think that we can say that corporately, all of us together, that that's a reality that we have to recognize. So when we look at finances, I think we have to apply the same thing. Are we being good stewards? Are we being evangelizers? What we're called to in those documents is to do both. They go hand in hand. So if we're good stewards of what God's given us, we evangelize naturally. And therefore, all the things that we heard the young people speak about during lunch, that's something, the evangelization happens, parishes come alive. And this is also what Pope Francis is really calling us to. So if you hear again and again and again, he's saying, follow Christ, be good stewards, evangelize. That's what I'm hearing. So then there's the national organization of the church. So at the bishops' conference, we work for the bishops. The bishops tell us what to do, and our job as staff is to implement that. Same thing, I guess you could say, happens at the diocesan level. Those that run the diocese, the bishop that runs the diocese and his staff, in a sense, are the governance, set the task. But those who are often doing the work are lay people, so there's a co-responsibility of tasks there. And so the way I see it often in my work at a national level or at a diocesan level is I'm really working with gatekeepers. I'm working with those who I have to follow their lead and their direction so that we can actually take the message that needs to be given and bring it to everybody. And then the more and more that the church comes alive, then everyone kind of follows into their proper place. So that's kind of my take on, in a sense, on co-responsibility. And I think that that's something vital for transparency. So I deal with national collections, and it is a whole system from the top down that if it doesn't work correctly from the pew when someone puts money in the basket all the way up, then we have major stewardship problems, we have major credibility problems, and we don't follow the intent of the donor. And eventually the donor is disillusioned and then doesn't give because there's not the trust to do that. So a co-responsibility where everyone is in their proper roles and doing what their roles are, in my mind, leads to transparency. And that's where something like the Leadership Roundtable and professionals come in, because the professional services that I have as an accountant, as a publisher, as maybe that my background might bring me to bear, are things that more than likely the person I'm working with doesn't have. And so it's I think in the Christian life, it's always about unity. It's always about harmony. It's always about working together. And so I think the call deep down is a call of stewardship that leads to unity so that we can evangelize. And so I think the church has to be an organization that has a higher model, that we really have to be, and what we haven't maybe done and why people got disillusioned and why often there's people that are turned away is because we're not the model that we're called to be. We're not a credible witness that evangelizes. And so I think that's the introspection that we have to have. And we also have to become a model of best practices. So that's what our document that the bishops put out was urging all the parishes, dioceses, and the USCCB to do and to aspire to. And that's what I think as a professional that I'm trying to work to urge the leadership, the people in the pews on to do. So leadership across the continent of the United States where we work, across Latin America, Eastern Europe, but also in our local parishes as well. So that's my take on co-responsibility. And at the end, I have a question that I'll pose, but I'll let my colleagues speak first. Thank you.
Thanks, Pat. Can you hear me all right? So as Tom said, my name is Brian Hughes, and by way of background, I was asked by Jeff and Carrie last fall to join the National Leadership Roundtable team to lead this investment initiative. I was flattered when Jeff asked me. I've spent most of my career in financial services. In the last 10 years, really kind of focused on the wealth management space. Worked with George Russell at Russell Investments, but on his family office project, and then a firm called Pitcairn in Philly prior to that. So, I feel like I have a pretty good sense of the marketplace. And when I was asked to do this panel today, I was thinking about, what could I share with you with regards to, financial stewardship and from an investment standpoint. So where I thought I'd start with was, if you could pull the slides up, here we go. So I'll refer to another document. This one actually is the bishop's document in 2003, referring to the investment policy for socially responsible investing. And as you can see, the document itself in general addresses two major issues. One is financial stewardship, and what does that mean? And they refer to it as making sure it has a reasonable rate of return at or above market rates. And then the major portion of the document refers to ethical and social stewardship and investment policy, based on Catholic moral principles. So I use that as kind of a foundation to talking about what's out there in the marketplace, and what are others doing, what are best practices. So as Jeff alluded to this morning, if you look at just the marketplace in general, what are other religious organizations doing? How are they pooling their assets? And there are lots of examples. You've got the Episcopal Church Foundation. Again, and I'll get into kind of nuances of when it comes to best practices, kind of what are the pieces that need to be in there. And I'm not making any judgments around best practices, from an investment standpoint, but just the fact that these religious organizations have pooled their investments for the benefit of the greater organization. So they offer a balanced and fixed income portfolio, and they do incorporate SRI into their portfolios. Another example is the Evangelical Lutherans, $6 billion in 9 funds. They also incorporate SRI and also some positive screens. And then the Jewish Federation pooled funds. Again, these are more regional funds, but again, it gives the opportunity for smaller organizations within the Jewish Federation to pool their assets. So there are quite a few examples out there. And when Jeff had asked me to kind of lead this effort, I was shocked to learn that there was no a great example of a Catholic organization that is doing this on a national basis or even a regional basis. There are some examples out there, and certainly there are some people doing some good work. But from a best practice standpoint, if you look at all the let me get to best practices. So if you look at kind of what I've outlined as criteria here, it's common in the marketplace from a client standpoint. If you're on the other side and you're buying investments, what should you be thinking about? And independence is certainly near the top of the list. Transparency. Pat talked about transparency. We've talked a lot about transparency today, and we'll hear more about tomorrow in different areas. Access, and when I talk about access, not just to managers or the best managers, but investment talent, and then scale. And scale really comes into play in a lot of different areas. It affects fees, but it also affects, again, access to those managers, because most of the best managers, as some of you know, aren't accessible to very small organizations, even organizations under $100 million. Global reach, again, most of the programs that I've seen are they don't have access to the talent around the world or networks around the world that give them the ability to kind of be on the ground and know where to invest when it's needed. Catholic values, we've talked about. Alignment of interests, different than independence, but along the same lines, that you want to be, you want your investment expertise to really be sitting on the same side of the table as you, and that very rarely happens. Diversification across asset classes, again, as John and Katie and Jeff and others and myself have been out there in the marketplace, one of the things that we've learned very quickly is even the organizations that have $50 million, $60 million, $80, $100 million or less, they have very vanilla solutions. And the reason is they don't have the resources or the capital to get that kind of access and to get the expertise that can build the portfolios that are best in class. And then last, again, I talk about expertise. So these are, again, if someone's sitting on the side of the client, what are the things that you ought to be thinking about? What should your institutions, your parishes, your dioceses be thinking about as you make decisions to get the best investment solution? If you look at the marketplace of how you can access those kind of best practices, if you will, there's a variety of solutions, and there's no judgment of whether they're good or bad here. It's just, this is what the marketplace provides. Brokers, investment consultants, and they play different roles. Brokers typically are commissioned. You could say they're not aligned, you could say they're aligned, but at the end of the day, they sell a product, you get a commission. The work that was done in research came out of the financial crisis, and as most people probably are aware, the financial crisis was partially caused by this lack or this conflict or lack of aligned interest. Products were sold that may not have been in the best interest of buyers, and purely for the purpose of generating profit or assets under management. That certainly wasn't the entire cause, but that was an outcome of what happened. Investment consultants, again, play a very different role. Typically, they are non-discretionary, which simply means they prescribe, but they don't implement. Again, there's nothing wrong with that, but you have to know what you're getting, and you have to be able to have the expertise typically to implement what a non-discretionary advisor is going to provide. Banks, trust companies, institutions, again, great for product, great for research, great for global reach, a lot of capital, a lot of resources, and certainly expertise. Investment advisors, go back to that best practice around, independence being near at the top of the list. The difference between being independent and being part of a large institution is typically the institution's going to drive what gets sold and what gets pushed, right? We're going to create products. We're going to push those products out to the marketplace. Independent advisors are really a place where the investment buyer has an opportunity to work side by side with no general conflicts about selling particular products. So investment advisors offer a great place for independence. And then fund companies, really, which kind of points to a solution, if you will, or an access to investments that isn't on this list, and that is the do-it-yourselfers. Most organizations that we run into, unless they've got $200 to $300 million or more, are somewhere in that do-it-yourself role, where they either have an investment committee or a finance committee that's charged for implementing an investment policy, and they do that by going out and accessing other expertise, whether they're products or directly to fund companies. And the decisions that are made in that investment committee or finance committee, as you can imagine, typically get made on a quarterly basis. So the ability to be nimble is certainly lost in that environment. So these are the ways that the Catholic community accesses investments. And then the last piece here is really kind of what they're buying, and again, it seems obvious, but many of the organizations that we run into have just strictly stock and bond portfolios built by a portfolio manager at maybe a bank or a trust company, or they access mutual funds, so they can get access to diversification. They get access to different asset classes through mutual funds, including alternative funds, hedge funds, private equity, real estate, hard assets. And then there's also the what we call allocation funds, which are, again, typically you invest your money in a balanced fund or a growth fund or a fixed income fund. So different products out there, lots of different solutions. And so now you kind of run into what are the obstacles of making sure that you're aligning the best practices with what's out there in the marketplace. And what we see are real challenges in getting access and getting to the right decision makers. The decision-making process in general with the organizations that we are in front of is challenging because you've got to find the right person in that organization. You've got to get introduced the right way, and then understanding how they make decisions. So access and getting powerful introductions is really critically important to be successful for this initiative. But whenever you're trying to create change, access is really important. Understanding the decision-making process is critical. Prioritization of investment needs. So where does investments kind of fit in the prioritization list, if you will, of the diocese or the archdiocese or the college or the university or the family foundation? Well, in family foundations, it's, they've got kind of two roles, right? Grant making and in kind of managing the assets to provide the grant making. In a diocese or archdiocese or even parishes, there are numerous obligations and prioritized needs that have to happen. And just a quick example of what we run into. Earlier this year, we met with an archdiocese, and they expressed a really strong interest in this Catholic investment initiative. And they went so far as a sit-down meeting and kind of shared that they were reviewing their existing relationship with an investment consultant. Trying to analyze, are we getting value for the dollars that we're spending? And they were ready to move to the next step, a pretty substantial portfolio, and wanted to, not just kick the tires, but really understand the details of the offering and how the team was built. And, they wanted to really get down deep and understand the solutions. And then in the process of scheduling that kind of due diligence meeting, my conversation was with this particular person, well, it's now that time of the year where we've got these other 4 priorities that are now on my plate, so I've got to move this to the back burner, so can you call me in July? So getting this to be a priority is a challenge. And keeping it a priority, I've found, is even more of a challenge. So, there's lots of issues that we have to face, but prioritization is really a key one. Existing relationships that are in place. You've got investment committees. You've got existing, investment fund manager relationships, product relationships, donor relationships, where in many cases they're coming to the table. They're huge benefactors to that organization, or even a diocese or archdiocese, and they believe that they can bring investment talent, and they want to make sure that, by having that access, it gives them the ability to bring kind of their buddy into the picture. So we deal with those relationships as well, and that can be very challenging because those benefactors are really critical to the support of that organization. And so existing relationships and even investment committee relationships. So, the way we look at this from a solution standpoint is, we feel that we've got something in place that allows us to overcome a lot of these challenges. But frankly, as you'll hear a little bit later today, if you listen in on the kind of the deep dive into the investment initiative itself, you'll understand that there are challenges, but we believe strongly that with your help and the help of the greater community, that we can overcome some of these obstacles. But just some of the things that we've done are build a discovery process that addresses both what I call shopping and satisfaction stage opportunities. And I won't go into it in detail, but if you think about the spectrum of buyers out there, when it comes to Catholic organizations or anything, if you had a room of 1,000 people and you asked how many in this room right now out of the 1,000, raise your hand if you bought a car or in the process of buying a car. Right now, you'd probably get 3 to 7% of the people in the room raising their hand. Well, it's no different in the investment landscape. There's about 3 to 7% of the people that we talk to that are actively looking for a new solution. So the process that we'd use to uncover finding the best solution for them is very different than those that are what I call satisfaction buyers. And those are the ones who are, not happy with their existing solution, not happy with their existing portfolio, but aren't yet ready to go out shopping. So we use a discovery process that allows us to kind of uncover needs as opposed to criteria for solving a particular solution. Getting powerful introductions, this network, the ability to access relationships that can allow us to get in the right doors and then be able to move the process along is critically important for us. So as Jeff had mentioned this morning, we kind of painstakingly have went out and looked at who are the kind of bellwether leaders and then tried to get in front of the right people. And we need your help, and we need the help of the greater community to be able to identify who those, powerful introductions are. And the last is, just being able to prioritize opportunities. And what that simply means is having a process that allows us to say, these are the opportunities that are the best for this particular initiative. We need to stay in front of those, and they'll move over time, but we can continue to prioritize to make sure that we're constantly staying in front of the right ones and not spending time with those that just aren't a good fit. So I'm going to stop there.
Okay, thank you. Unlike what Patrick was saying earlier, I have spent a very small amount of my career in not-for-profit. My background was all sales and marketing, high tech. I was a vice president for HP. I retired at the ripe old age of 46. And this is I'm living the perfect encore career. So all of these organizations popping up about encore opportunities, I'm living the perfect encore career. This morning we've talked a lot, thoughtfully, hopefully, but about problems. It's areas of the church that concern us, areas of our parish life we wish were more vibrant, communities that we wish we could engage better. There's one thing that Catholics do extremely well, and that is social ministry. Whether you're talking about kindergartners saving their pennies, or parishioners reaching out to their neighbors, or the institution of Catholic Charities. We do that extremely well. Here in Santa Clara County, far and away, the largest provider of social service that's not government is the Catholic community, far and away. We do it really, really well. We also have a great, strong support of philanthropy. Again, everything from the kindergartners saving their pennies to people who make multi-million-dollar donations to this university. We have a great network of philanthropy. So if you think about an arc, almost picture in your minds this arc that goes from philanthropic intent to meeting a need. What we do is just seek to make that bigger and more efficient. So, bigger. This is a great thing. In fact, the first time I heard Chuck Geschke speak at a Roundtable event, he started by saying, Catholics just don't give enough. Well, as much as we know really, really generous people, statistically, he's right. When Mitt Romney was running for president and there was a lot of talk about how faith-driven he was or about how formed he was by his Mormonism, there was this whole discussion of tithing. And the Wall Street Journal did a report on giving by religion. So the big number everyone knows about the Mormons is 10% tithing. And Mormons, on average, give 7% of their gross income. That's a huge number. Catholics, on average, 0.7%. Now, you could argue, if you look at those who go to church more regularly or very involved in their parishes, it's a much higher number. Of course, it's a much higher number. But average to average, let's just say room for improvement. So what we like to talk about is this concept of compound Catholic philanthropy. An accretive event, the sum being larger than its parts. And again, it's back to saving pennies, or maybe it's gathering on a Saturday to paint the gym at a local Catholic school that simply has no money, or maybe it is an individual multi-million-dollar gift, or maybe in the case of our formation of our foundation, it's a campaign. And here in the Diocese of San Jose, our bishop and the whole team had this vision of starting to provide long-term permanent financial support of the ministries of this diocese. And the way I like to best characterize how I view the success of the campaign is that someone from St. Simon's is going to help someone at Most Holy Trinity go to school 200 years from now. And so that is really the basis of what a foundation is all about. And that's what forms the basis of compound Catholic philanthropy. So you take that to the next level, and it's really the model of the community foundation. This idea of providing permanent, reliable financial support through funds. So a community foundation is simply a collection of funds put together by people who care about some common need. Typically, it's geographic. Our great neighbor is the Silicon Valley Community Foundation, the largest community foundation in the United States. They have almost $2.5 billion now. They're a good partner of ours. We're exactly the same thing, a collection of funds seeking to provide financial strength for ministries and allowing donors to more effectively match their dollars with their philanthropic intent. We do that in a much narrower context. So all we're focused on is the health of the ministries, the Catholic ministries of Santa Clara Valley. So that's parishes, schools, religious orders, hospital foundation, everyone that sort of Catholic charities, everyone that comprises this incredible network of outreach. Because these great ministries ask us for money, we have an opportunity to see what I call pockets of innovative outreach. Everything from the parish that I grew up in, about 2 miles from here, that serves sandwiches to its neighbors 6 days a week, 52 weeks a year, to a parish in the east side of San Jose in a very poor area that rents buses on the weekend to make sure that seniors can go to Mass. And I could tell you stories for hours, and it would just make you so happy to be Catholic and so proud, not in a seven deadly sins way, of these great things that we do. It's all we want to do is make those bigger and stronger. And here's the problem. All of these ministries, from the poorest Catholic school to what we would maybe say the most affluent Catholic school, from the kindergarten program to the great, wonderful institution of Catholic Charities, every one of them is very, very focused on annual giving, very focused on simply raising enough money to make sure we don't have a budget problem this year. Almost none of them pay very much attention on building endowments, on building financial strength for the future, and to Brian's point, which makes me very excited about this initiative, on the management of that. You know, even large organizations, even very sophisticated parishes, aren't necessarily thinking in terms of this permanent financial support, and then how do we sustain this from a fiduciary perspective, and how do we deal with the complexities and cost of fund management? That's what we do. That's how we provide support. So when people ask me, how do I differ from Catholic Charities or the Bishop Circle of Excellence or my parish or my child's school, or are you just one more thing that's the person that's going to be asking me for money? The answer is absolutely not. We are not in direct ministry per se. We only seek to make those who are financially stronger and less reliant on annual giving. So I want to just give you a few quick examples, and I'm going to help bring us back on track time-wise. Think about types of funds. We have beneficial endowments. So all that means is it's a fund that's meant for one or very few purposes. That's what a parish endowment is. We have an endowment for a cathedral. It's only for the physical health of the building. So we have a couple $1 million in an endowment fund that spins off a check every year to the pastor and staff of the cathedral. And the last 2 years, they asked us if they could save it up for 2 years and paint the church. And we have this before and after picture of our gorgeous cathedral that you can see from your room in the hotel if you're on the right side of the hotel. And it's absolutely beautiful. It's the oldest non-mission Catholic church in California. It's a historical treasure. It's a religious treasure. And we have this little fund now that's just going to keep that building healthy. And there's all kinds of examples of that. We also provide for donor-advised funds, and many of you know about donor-advised funds, but all they are a means for a family or an individual to make a charitable donation and get the tax benefit of that and separate that event from the timing of giving out the money. And so over time, they can decide they want to give to their child's school or their parish. But what we can do is maybe help them see these little pockets of innovative outreach I talked about. And so perhaps a donor advisor tells us that they care very deeply about youth programs. We can say once or twice a year, not to the point of being obnoxious, but we can say once or twice a year, we know that you care about youth. Did you know? This actually happened a few months ago. Catholic Charities has a budget problem in this incredible youth center that they manage in a very poor area of San Jose. It wasn't $1 million budget gap. It was like $25,000. We could say to our donor advisors, we know you care about youth. Did you know that there's this immediate need? Would you care to contribute, right? That's the match. When you think about the philanthropic arc, it's making it bigger, because maybe that family wouldn't have given to Catholic Charities. Maybe they don't have a relationship with Catholic Charities, but they care about youth. Making it bigger, making it more targeted. And then to Brian's point, ensuring the long-term health of the funds. So we have a very, very sophisticated investment committee. We will deal with all of the accounting and administration so that the Catholic ministries don't have to think about that. What we allow is them not only not to think about that, but maybe over time to have to think less about annual giving. The last kind of fund I want to talk about really briefly is a field of interest fund, and these are the most fun. These are the funds that allow for ministries to apply to us for money. And I just have two great examples, one that we don't have and one that we do have. The one that we don't have is called the Colombo Fund. The Colombo sisters grew up in a very modest environment. They never married. They lived together. They lived in San Jose in a very modest home. And they built shopping centers. And they were very, very wealthy. They're both long in heaven now. And they have a fund. It's called the Colombo Fund. And they intend to give to Catholic ministries in Santa Clara County. And it's managed by a bank. And it's administered by a very, I'm sure, very ethical, very honest, very good-hearted board who will never have the view that we do about what's going on in Santa Clara Valley from a Catholic ministry perspective and what really cool little programs need a little more funding, right? This is our first connection with Esteem. So we have given grants to Esteem now for 4 years in a row. But not just Esteem, we've also given grants to other activities in the Catholic community at Stanford and in almost all of the 54 parishes of the diocese. And everything from Esteem to, in the case of the Stanford community, some new really innovative catechetical programs for very young children as well. And we just gave a grant for 5 parishes who are doing a cooperative on having a full family-based approach to their pastoral ministry and catechetical programs. So really, really making a difference with somewhere in the range of $1,000 to $10,000 per grant, relatively small grants. The one that we do have is one of our members of the Diocese of San Jose grew up in the Northwest, and her mom was the church organist. And she has these wonderful memories of going to 4 or 5 masses every weekend and not hating it, by the way. And so what their family is starting is a fund for liturgical music. So you think about how we all talk about wanting to increase the vibrancy of the worship experience. This fund that we manage by our grants committee will be available to parishes to apply to us to say, we have this really cool idea. Or we have 3 parishes that are going to get together and have a wonderfully nationally acclaimed music director come and speak to us on things we should be thinking about. You know, whatever, I can make up a million things. And then this fund will be available for anybody else who cares about liturgical music to put $10 in it, to donate whatever you think would be appropriate. And over time, and it will be endowed. So it's going to be there forever, and all it's going to do is grow. So you know, one of the things that Patrick started with was this idea that it's really cool to talk about methods and get very involved in budget, but it doesn't really mean anything unless you can talk about results. We have only one, ultimate measure. When we're successful, and I never say if, our results will be shown in our deeply broadened and careful grant making. Whether that's writing a check every year from a parish endowment that goes to that parish to be managed how they think best, or whether it's giving a grant to a parish for a kindergarten program, or a grant to a parish for a music instructor. It all stems from and goes back to our desire to increase the financial strength of the ministries that makes them more effective and more efficient in their ministry, which starts with the fact that we already do this extremely well. So I would just say, if you come from a diocese that doesn't have a Catholic foundation, or you're starting one, please talk to us. We talk to dioceses and archdioceses across the United States all the time, and we are willing to share everything that we've learned, everything that we've done, our business plans, our financial models, everything. And Mary Dunn is also here, and she's the executive director of the Catholic Community Foundation for the Archdiocese of Santa Fe. It's been around a lot longer than we have. So we encourage you to get involved in the model, and we think that it's going to bear great fruits. Thank you.
Thank you, Mary. Thank you, Brian. Thank you, Pat. It's This is the plenary portion where you all get to ask questions and create the discussion, but we're going to start reversing a little bit. And Patrick had a question for you all, and we thought that'd be a good way to start.
Yeah, we've talked a lot about very temporal issues, managing money, philanthropy, getting donations, getting results. So one thing that I would say, I would ask you to reflect on before you start asking questions of us. So just more like a reflection question. And this is for each one of us personally, just to think, what do you think your roles are in supporting the church, in being witnesses that evangelize, that make disciples? Because ultimately that's what it's about. We have a missionary call to go and make disciples. So what we talked about can evangelize. So what role do you have in that? So I just ask you to reflect on that for a minute and then ask us all the questions that you would like.
Lori?
Pat, the question, I guess, is directed at you. You made a comment earlier that due to loss of respect, there's significant donor disillusionment. And what I'd love to know, on behalf of other parishes who are struggling with how to get parishioners to open up their pocketbooks, whatever precipitated that situation may be different for each parish. But, I mean, have you seen any best practices at the national level or best strategies and approaches that have been most effective in helping to regain the confidence? I mean, we've started by making a pastoral plan for the first time in decades, by making it transparently available. But what we're looking for is what we might have missed. What have you seen that can help parishes who are struggling with this?
Well, the first thing that I've seen is that people are extremely generous, even when they're hurting. When the earthquake happened in Haiti, in one weekend, we raised $85 million, one appeal in parish churches across the country. $85 million. But for a specific other directed event, I mean, yeah. Their own parish. Exactly. So my first point is that people are generous. So we have to recognize that and not be afraid to ask people. So I think that's my first point, is know they're generous, know that we are a generous people, and we want to give. We want to be a part of it. And when there is an appeal, people respond. So I think that's the first point. So not to be afraid that maybe we make mistakes, we've done things that are wrong, and people even may be hurt, but they're still giving. And people do, when people, what I saw from a national level is the only time our collections dropped is when they weren't held. When we hold a collection, when a parish will hold it, when a diocese will let it happen, people will give. If we don't hold that collection, if a bishop gets mad at CCHD and cancels the collection, well, you know what? It drops. But if it's held, the money comes in. So for me, that's a really important thing, is that people will give when they feel that something is valid, worthwhile. So how do we gain back that, or how do we maintain that, or how do we arrive at it? I think what you said answered the question. It is transparency. It is returning, telling people what we're doing with their money is a major part of it. I mean, so we all know that. But you can also not tell people. So in the case, let's take an example of Peter's Pence. I have to raise money for the Holy Father for Peter's Pence. I don't know what to say, because we don't have the data, and I keep telling our nuncios, we need data, what we doing with the money. You got to tell us, we got to tell people. And Archbishop Sambi was a big supporter of that idea completely, as is our current nuncio. But the problem that we're facing is that it's going to places where the church is persecuted. I mean, I know that because I see that. And so it's difficult to tell that story. But the thing is that there is a trust factor there. So people do trust the Holy Father. Thank God. And so they give. But if we destroy that trust, then we have a major problem. And the best way is transparency, I think, being open and being accountable.
Can I just respond, Lori, to 1 second more? Back 7 or 8 years ago, at the height of the crisis, I think our diocese, at least, was very worried about this transparency credibility question. And what the bishop did was he appointed a group of lay people who undertook to look at where all the grants were going to go and then report back to every parish their observations and their comfort with the process. Because the truth is, even if you get a whole list of things, that may be so much information, there's no insight into it. And so he intermediated a process to give people confidence, and actually we saw a substantial increase in the collection. Betty Ann?
Betty Ann Donnelly from the Donnelly Foundation. Patrick, as a follow-up question on that, and I understand the sensitivity with Peter's Pence in the Vatican, but say, for example, the collection, our national collection for Africa, it was discovered in the wake of the Katrina collection, for example, that the women religious were not getting the money, and so that was corrected. But say, for example, the collection for Africa, how much specific information do you put up on the website as to where the money is going? So we have connections with Maryknoll, we have connections with Jesuits. You know, if I know that Pete Henrio is raising money for a fantastic new co-ed Jesuit high school in Malawi, which is really well designed, why wouldn't I just give money to him rather than putting it in the collection basket for Africa in general, where we don't know where it's going? And I understand that the U.S. bishops have to partner with the African bishops, but how much specificity do you put on the website in terms of where the money's going?
Two things. First, I'm a big fan of Peter, so please give him all the help you can. I think he's great. We don't do enough. We really have to improve. And so I take that as, when I talk about accountability, transparency, I feel like I'm in first person to do that. So we're very much working on that. We do list what our grant policies and requirements are, as foundations do. So we make it clear who we're going to give the money to and what it's going to be for. And then we do put lists of who is the recipients of the funds from that collection. So that goes out there. And then in the materials for to promote the collection, we try to tell as many stories as we can. And the other thing that we'd like to take advantage of is, with social media, is more and more to tell stories. And I think that that's part of the feedback that all of us that run foundations, or the more that we can tell people stories of what happened, it not only shows an accountability for the funds, but it also evangelizes. And it also keeps us in mind that we're not a parochial church. We're a Catholic church. We're universal. And so that's what I think those collections do, is they always call us to something more. And they always call us to not just our own parochial problems, but to realize that around us there are as well. So we can improve, and we're trying to, but I think that's a challenge that we all face.
Jeff?
I'm just sort of curious of this, and I can't resist asking. Sometimes people will say, I'm not going to give, because they want to send a signal, you know, and there have been moments on that. So I can think of the Archbishop's appeal or something like that. There was a time when the group of people said, I'm just not going to give it that one because I'm mad, and I've got to voice my mad. But of course, every parish is taxed. So I personally, I'm a Dame of Malta, so I wrote a really lovely letter to the bishop and said, I'm not giving this year. I'm waiting for the bishops to talk. So I'm not going to give it, but I'm going to continue to my parish. And I CC'd my, parish priest. I received a letter from him. I never received a letter from the bishops or or anyone from the diocese. And what the parish priest said is, I understand where you're coming from, and I'm glad you wrote a nice letter, but of course, I'm going to have to fill in what you don't give us to contribute. So I'm just wondering, I can't resist, how do you read, sort of the voice of when there isn't someone there because they're trying to send a signal?
Wow. Well, I guess a lot of that is more handled better at a local level because you can actually hear it. There's 19,000 parishes, and so we receive a lot of mail, a lot of emails, and we try to respond to as much as we can. I have to be honest, I didn't respond to one the other day because it seemed like a pretty angry rant, and I didn't know if it was, going to be helpful to feed the fire. So you get that too. But for the most part, from our perspective, I know that Cardinal Dolan, who's the president of the conference, receives a lot of mail. In fact, part of my job is drafting letters all the time. Which both Cardinal George and Cardinal Dolan, who I've worked directly for, I've seen them go through and completely change a draft that I've sent, which, Bernie can attest to that. So I think that there is the desire to talk to that person, to be there.
So much return letter because I have to write all sorts of letters too. I get all the complaints from a dean. So
You know how it goes.
But I do believe in responding to that. I meant more, how do you read if all of a sudden the donations go down? I mean, because they would, or do you never see it because
Well,
parishes have to fill in? I mean, do you try to detect?
no, we would see it. I mean, we track it as close as we can. We try to understand what the trends are, right? So, for example, we did lose, our collections were growing and then they went down at a certain point, but we attribute it to the financial crisis more than anything else. Or, like I said, in the case of CCHD, when people don't have an opportunity anymore because all of a sudden it's just not there, we kind of know what that's about. The other thing that we've seen happening, and so it's hard to say this is because people are unhappy. We saw bumps from some dioceses in some of the collections because people were unhappy with their bishop. So I knew that that was what was going on. And some of them I talked to and joked and said, hey, you know that we got a bump. And, you know, so you kind of know that's what's going on. But we try to follow trends. We try to understand as much as possible. And we try to give feedback to the bishops, you know, so that they know what we're seeing on a national level. Not only, I mean, I get calls from the press about giving and what's happening. So we try to be as available as we can to studies because it's important to know where things are going and people's satisfaction level or dissatisfaction. I mean, I tell people all the time that I think the ballet's the most wonderful thing in the world. I love it, and I think that we should support it. But I also think that if Catholics knew and had an opportunity to give to all these wonderful things that we're doing, you know, rather than that $50,000 check there, it might go to the community foundation. But we just got to let them know that there's that opportunity. So they may be dissatisfied for some reason, but there's still opportunities to support the church. I don't know if that's the best answer, but.
Jeff?
Yeah, this is maybe a little bit of a comment, and maybe there's a question that will come out of this. But you know, we've been talking a lot about giving, and as one of the people who get a lot of the requests for giving, I actually think about this differently. I think about the difference between investing and giving, and I think people invest in people and ideas, and the reason why Santa Clara has done well, or Notre Dame has done well, or Boston College, or Georgetown, or whatnot, is because people believe in those ideas, believe in those people, and there's an emotional connection to it. You know, I think it's quite apparent that the church in general, the hierarchical church, has a huge problem here by virtue of the numbers that we're talking about. And we need, and the reason why we were developing at the Roundtable this notion of, you know, bringing the 100 leading Catholic philanthropists together, and one of the issues is how do we get the community foundations working together? How do we get the philanthropic Catholic community working together strategically, and to have, you know, our voice heard on some of these issues, both strategically and some of the things, in order to, because it may be the only way that we can gain the attention of on some of the issues that we're talking about, is talking through the pocketbook. And, you know, I'd be curious as to see whether or not we can get a conversation going here. You know, the Porticus Foundation has been terrific, you know, working with us on the standards of excellence. And one of the things that they were suggesting is that, you know, having all of the donors that they're involved in or at Fatica and some of the other groups, make sure before they give or invest, they make sure that the institution that they're giving or investing in adhere to those standards. And that is a way to actually start to see the you know, some of these best practices being used. But I would sort of hope that we could get a little bit of a conversation going here on how we can start working together to communicate some of the notions that we've talked about through, you know, through this notion of the power of the pocketbook.
Someone, yes.
Just one question.
Just identify, I have forgotten to remind everybody to identify themselves, please.
Father Brendan McGuire. Oh, there you go. Father Brendan McGuire. I'm Vicar General here at the Diocese of San Jose, but also pastor at one of the local parishes. So one of my experiences working with fellow pastors is that they fundamentally, they're untrained with regards to asking for money. They're terrified, in fact, I would go one step. They're terrified that one annual report to actually have to go out and ask for money, and they don't believe fundamentally the course. First of all, they get no training in seminary at all with regards to stewardship. It is simply a complete lacuna, and I don't know how we address that. But from the point of view of the training and understanding that people want to be asked, and the part of the thing that's missing is the articulation by the pastor for a vision for which people will give to. So I don't know if any of you could speak a little bit about how to help pastors articulate clarity to the vision. And the vision is nothing more than what we do as church. Like, in other words, this is what we're going to do. These are different ministries, much like what Mary was speaking at earlier. But when we don't articulate the vision, we're never going to get the money. So I'm not sure who of you are best to speak to that, but I think somehow, again, it comes back to basic communication skills. And the pastors are terrified about asking for money because they fundamentally think they're always asking for money because there's a collection every Sunday. And what they don't understand is that people don't mind that. People understand that. And they don't mind a second offering because they want to give to that too. But pastors think you're always just asking for money. So I'd be curious how you speak to that.
Well, so one thing that we talk a lot about is the sort of the universe of stewardship. And I think your parish is actually a model of this. Stewardship starts with the worship experience. And so the parishes that do the best at asking for money don't start there at all. The pastors that do the best start with this concept of a robust worship experience, a welcoming environment, an overt welcoming process, a network of invitation to get involved. And then once you get involved, your propensity for giving is, exponentially larger. And I think pastors who understand that, who aren't necessarily sales and marketing types, if you will, are still going to be better at growing the envelope because they've created an essence of stewardship in their communities. And we're starting to see that much, much more through this diocese. My parish is 100 years old and in a really wonderful area of this valley. And we're just now starting what I would consider a very robust stewardship program. But I do think that we need to both train the pastors and complement the pastors. And so earlier when we were talking about leadership styles, and the best leaders are those that recognize their strengths and complement areas where they're not as strong. Our former pastor at St. Mary's was exactly that. He knew where he was strong. And he then complemented that with the committee structure and his little kitchen cabinet and the people that helped him sort of do the big asks for money and all of that. So I think there's a combination of training, but you're never, the mandate for a pastor is impossible if you think that person has to do it alone. It's everything from nurture pastorally to balance the books in a very, very professional way and manage people and personalities and volunteers. And so it's an impossible mandate. And what I think that Roundtable is very much about is the construct of support for the pastor that makes that easier. But I still think, Father Brendan, that there needs to be actual overt training for the pastors in stewardship. Not just asking for money, but the broad concept of stewardship, which you guys are already doing here in this diocese.
Can I say, I'll just say two things about that. One is I agree wholeheartedly, but I also think, well, first I'll start with that because I want to talk about something Jeff had said. So certainly training has to be done for people that are in leadership positions, and often there's not enough there. And I think the fact that at the Mid-Atlantic Conference there's an opportunity for bishops to come and learn about management and leadership, that's on the right track as far as I'm concerned. We're doing something similar in Eastern Africa right now through the Bishops' Conference, working with the University of Notre Dame, and we're offering leadership courses for church personnel. And I'm really hoping that this institution can be a part of that, and we've had conversations already. And we've already trained about 60 bishops in the same kind of thing, and now we're doing vicar generals and then taking it to the next level. So there is a lot of room for that, and I think that can be something that more and more we can do. But I would say it goes back to maybe that's not the pastor's job, right? Maybe that's not his role, because if we're co-responsible, that go back to the idea of co-responsible. Maybe that's my job. I'm just happy if the pastor, from my perspective, at least lets it happen. We're halfway home. He's the gatekeeper. So at least if he'll let it happen, somebody else can talk about it, or nobody. Put it in the bulletin. Most people don't have to hear too much and they'll give. They just have to be prepared for it. So I think the training is important and vital, and I think we have to continue moving in that direction. But I think it's a co-responsibility, identify the people, or we need to step up and say, hey, Father, I can do that on this Sunday.
Let me make a comment or two, and then I know Jeff wanted to say something too. Let me start. Almost none of us like asking. And tell your pastors that. I don't like asking. I do it a lot, but I don't like it. So I have to convince myself that what I'm asking for is so worthwhile that I can get over my own discomfort. Now, the beauty of being a pastor, if you don't do it too often, you're going to somebody who in many ways is already convinced. He or she has said they're a Catholic. They've said they're a member of the church. They're probably coming to church. It isn't alien. You're asking them to participate in something they've already said yes to. So in that one sense, I don't mean to be crass about it, but it's a question of how much, not if. But do, if it's helpful, tell them that everybody hates doing this, but you need to do it. You need to do it anyway. And it doesn't need to be long. The ask can be quick. It needs to be thoughtful. And it shouldn't be too often. If you have to ask too often, then you wear out your welcome, and then that's a disaster. Jeff, did you want to add?
My response to that would be a little bit what we were talking about before, investing. I'm going to embarrass somebody in the hall, and he's probably getting ready for it, is Father Jack Wall, who has done this at the parish level, has done it at the national level better than anybody. He starts with the mission. He articulates the mission specifically, and how it gets back to the thing that you talked about, the evangelization issue, consistently. But, he breaks it down so you understand what the function of where that money is going to and how it's going to impact the mission. But people are investing in the mission, but they're investing in him because they have confidence in him. He personifies what, the people that he's communicating with like about the church, and epitomize. And I can embarrass, Father Monin or Steve Prevet or some of these people who have been very, very successful. They personify and epitomize the best hopes of the people that they're asking from. But they've surrounded themselves with competent people, just like you just talked about, who are going to use that money and invest that money in an intelligent way. And then the transparency comes in terms of the results. So this is not rocket scientry. And, but there are very, very specific steps that have to be taken. And I think it starts, with that leadership and that articulation of the mission. But Jack, you might want to talk about it. You're the best at this, so.
I think Jack's going to let Michael Bruff give us all the hook.
I've got some good news for you. The questions that have just been raised are what we're going to spend the next hour and a half looking at in the different work groups that we're moving to shortly. So thank you to the panel for the presentations.